be taking you through project management over the next few lesson plans and introducing the concepts of project management for BCom students. The module code is PRMN6210. And in terms of the module outcomes, after completing this module, you should have a passable understanding of project management. And also through doing your assignment, you should have some of the skills of developing a project proposal, going through a project and using some of the tools that we use in managing a project. So just as introduction, let me just take you through very briefly the structure of the course. So the first learning unit deals with project management and understanding project management. The second one deals with project identification. So you have a project or you have several projects in which you have to identify and select. And that chapter will deal with what the selection criteria is and how you go about selecting the right project. Then we get into some of the skills and some of the important elements of project management. The first one is a project proposal. So even once you've selected your project, you will then have to write a project proposal, which you then hand over to your client. And within a project proposal, there are different elements of it. It includes everything from cost, all of the resources that you're going to need, and most importantly, a project timeline that you will be using in order to illustrate to the client how long the project will take. Then you have then we go into project resource utilization and schedule development. And what this is, it allows you to schedule your project using some of the software and as well as a specific process that we'll talk through in the chapter. The fifth learning unit deals with project management software, and you'll get introduced to some of the skills that you'll be using to schedule a project, to allocate resources, to cost a project. And it's always quite an interesting thing because after doing that particular unit, you'll be able to tackle your assignment, which includes some of that skills that you'll pick up interacting with the project management software. We then go into project costs and budgets and project risks, and then finally understanding that projects consist, even though project consists of people, and managing people is a project manager's most important skill that they have to develop, because ultimately you don't manage the project, you manage the people doing the project. So that's just a very brief overview of the entire module. So chapter 1 deals with introduction to project management, and I will touch on very briefly what a project is. I will go over the difference between project and a project management, some of the key constraints. I'll also go through explaining some of those key constraints and some of the things that you have to hold in tension. I'll touch on the life cycle of project. If a project has a life cycle, and I'll talk through that. And then also the elements of the project management process. And in there, we'll talk through everything from the proposal to the budgeting process, to the presentation to the client, as well as the closing down of the project. We'll evaluate the engagement of the project stakeholders, as well as the benefits of project management and some of the critical success factors. What makes a project successful at the end of the day? So this particular video deals with a project versus what is project management. So let's understand what a project is. A project generally has a very clear objective. It has a starting point. It has a very specific time frame. It has a unique one-time endeavor, meaning that it is something that is unique. It's not something that happens frequently. It has a sponsor, which means it has a client or somebody that is paying for the project to be completed. And it also has some degree of uncertainty. So when we look at day-to-day operations within the organization, it generally tends to be things that have a high level of certainty. It's the same thing that happens every single day. Where our projects within organization are things that happen sort of once in a while, or they tend to be focused around a specific outcome. And generally, an organization would then allocate specific resources for that particular project to be completed. And it generally has a clear organizational objective. So projects can take place within an organization. A project can take place outside of an organization. A project, organizations' business models and their work processes are based around projects. So for example, take a company that develops game software. They have a matrix type organization. So every single piece of gaming software, or piece of software that they develop, they they approach it like a project, which means it has a certain resource allocated to it. It has a specific time frame. It has a client, the external client that sponsors the project. Another type of project would be, or another type of company that runs around a matrix type structure would be an advertising company, in which it has an external sponsor that sponsors the particular endeavor or the particular advertising campaign. Then also what they would tend to do is they would have allocated a specific marketing team to it and a specific advertising team that ultimately runs that project for them. So a project can be used or can be seen within an organization in which there's a specific outcome that needs to be done, or it can be seen some organizations run their own projects or run around a matrix structure in which everything that they do are project based. So now let's have a very brief look at project constraints. What are these project constraints? And this figure is quite interesting because this is exactly what the project manager looks like. It is juggling these constraints because within each project, you have these competing constraints, but they also have to be held in balance. They also have to be held in what we call intention. So as an example, the advertising agency gets a contract or gets a project proposal from a client in order to deliver a piece of advertising campaign for them, and they give them a certain quality standard that they have to adhere to, and they also give them a schedule, and they give them a budget. Now, the client then comes later on as the project busy developing and say, I don't particularly like what you guys have given me. I don't particularly like the quality that you have delivered up to this point. And you have to go off and reshoot the advert. Now, that then has impact on the project schedule. And how do you manage that as an advertising agency? How do you manage that as a project manager? You then have to tell the client, listen, this project will take longer. But the client says, no, I'm launching the product at a certain time. Now I can see now these two are now in conflict. Not only that, you also have a budget that now suddenly is out of the water. Now, as a project manager, you have to continually juggle all of these constraints: project scope, the customer satisfaction, the risk that the project might not take place, or the risk to the project resources that you allocate at the beginning of the project, the budget, the schedule, the stakeholders. All of these are quite important elements that have to be balanced to ultimately deliver the project to your client and to the sponsor. So what do a project manager do? What do they do on a day-to-day basis? They have to prevent, they have to anticipate, and they have to overcome, which means they have to continually review the project plan. They have to continually anticipate the resources that's required. And like every single project, it's not a matter of if something goes wrong. It is a matter of when something goes wrong, because again, going back, every project has a certain degree of uncertainty. Because if it was 100% certain everything that will happen, then it's not a project. Therefore, project manager will have to continuously um, look into the future almost and see what are the things that's going to happen, which I have to anticipate now already and start allocating resources to. And that resources can be a person, that resource can be money, that resources can be a specific activity, and ultimately that resource can be time as well. Ultimately, a project manager is responsible. They are not necessarily, they are responsible and accountable for the success of the project. And this is where the rubber hits the road, because the project manager is not necessarily the person that's going to be doing all of the work. And in most cases, the project manager does very little of the actual day-to-day stuff other than managing the project overall. But ultimately, they are going to be responsible for making sure that the project is aligned to the organizational objectives, and ultimately that the project is successful. Every project has a life cycle. Every project has a start point and has a definitive end point. And every project has what we call initiation, a planning phase, a performing phase, and a closing phase. And each one is equally important. Some would say that the planning phase is very important, because if you don't have a decent plan, then you won't be able to perform. Others would say that if you don't pick the right project, then you can't plan for it. Others would say that the closing is the most important point, because that's the point where you present to the client, and that's the point in which the client signs it off and you finally get paid your last bit of money, and potentially get new business from the client. So each one of these are important in their specific way. Initiation is important because you need to make sure that you choose the right project, and you need to ensure that you get a right brief and a correct brief from the client, so that you can fully understand as a project manager and as a project team what is required from you. Planning is important because if you don't have a good plan, you don't know the resources, you don't know your budget, you don't know your timeline, and you won't be able to do what you need to do. In a performing phase, it is very important, simply because this is when you actually do the project. This is when you actually complete and execute the project. Closing is equally important, because during the closing phase, that is when you look back at the project and you go, what are the key learnings and what are the key actions out of this project, which I can take with me into the next part of, um, of my work as a project manager. And that's also the key time in your closing phase, where you sit down with the client and say, here's the finished project. Have I met your expectations in terms of your time? Have I met your expectations in terms of the budget? Have I met your expectations in terms of your ultimate satisfaction? So now let's look at it individually. The initiation phase is the first phase of the project. It is where you identify the need or the problem or the opportunity that needs to be completed, or the particular project. And also this is where you determine if you are going to do the project, because not all projects necessarily is what you want to do. So for instance, if you're an advertising company and a client comes to you to do something that is outside of your, just because they're waving a lot of cash at you doesn't mean that you have to accept the project. There are certain things, a part of selecting a project is selecting the right project. And every project team, whether you're a company that manages a project or whether you're working internally in an organization as a project manager, your job is to ensure that you select the correct projects that has the right brief. Part of the initiation phase is to develop one of the key elements of project management, one of the key documents. And the first one is a project charter. In the project charter, you have your project rationale. Why am I doing this? The project objective. What is the outcome? The expected benefits for the organization, expected benefits for the client, and then the general requirements and conditions. These include things like these are the resources, the budget, a proposed timeline, and all of this. So this is the project charter is not the project proposal. Think of the project charter as a brief that you and your client write together, that the client then signs and says, this is what I agree to. This is the scope of the project. This is what the project looks like. This is what the outcome of the project is. The next part, which is your planning, is where you take your project charter and you turn it into a project proposal. This is also the phase where you look at your RFP, which is your request for a proposal, because you can then have your charters off by your client, and it's at this point where you almost pitch in inverted commas for the business, and you say, "Can I give you a proposal that you can sign off in order to confirm it as a contract?" The planning phase is an important part of it. And the next step, it's the second phase. It is where the project and plan the work and work the plan. This is the place where you put all of those things together, where the project charter has been signed off. Literally, the project charter has a space for the client signature. Now you have your brief. Now you have your charter. You can now go about putting together your base plan or your project proposal, in which you now put together your scope, deliverable, what needs to be done, how it will get done, who will do it, how long will it take, and how much will it cost, and most importantly, what are the risks for this project to take place or not. And this is where you actually put your actual resources and have your timeline. And this is also your planning phase is also part of your process, where you capture a lot of the information that you have onto a piece of software or onto some sort of tracking document. Some people use you can use everything from Excel through to some very fancy project management software, which is integrated with the cloud, integrated with people's calendars and all kinds of things. So this is the place where you put everything together, because ultimately this is what we call the baseline. This is what I'm planning to do. So when you present this to your client, you say to the client, this is what I commit to. Your third phase is where you actually go about doing what you need to do. And this is increase the pace as resources are added. You monitor and you've got a monitoring and control process. You have to continuously take corrective action in order to anticipate. Part of the actions of a project manager is to anticipate, manage and control changes with the sponsor's approval. Because again, it's not a question of when things will go wrong. It's not a question of if things go wrong. It's a question of when things go wrong, and things will go wrong in the project. And it's about the skill of the project manager to anticipate these changes, and how do you go about mitigating the risks, and all the customer's satisfaction and acceptance of the final deliverables. The closing phase is an important element, simply because this is the point where you hand over the project. This is also where your client make final payment, which is important. This is also where you evaluate staff and recognize what they've achieved. And also you conduct a post-project evaluation. You document all of the lessons that you've learned through the anticipation, the risks that you might not have foreseen. And you also archive your project documents, and you record, as I said, all the lessons learned. It's generally a little round table where you sit and you chat through what could have been done better, how things could have been changed, and what would help the next time. And this is an important process simply because this wraps up the process, both from a client point of view, but also from a point of view as project manager, where they finally sign it off and then move on to a different project. So this is what the entire project planning process looks like. We will be touching on each one of these in different parts and in different scopes, and you continue through this module. But essentially, you start off with the project objective. You define your scope in terms of this is what I need to do. And in your scope, it would also be your project charter. You create your work breakdown structure. Your work breakdown structure is generally part of your project plan. Your assigned responsibility is part of your project plan. Your specific activities is part of your plan. Your sequencing is part of the plan. Estimating the activity resources, which means what resources are you going to need? Do you need a laptop? Do you need specific tools in order to complete your specific activity? How long it will take? You then have your project schedule, which is literally a timeline from start to finish with all of the activities noted along the way. You estimate the activity cost and you finally determine your project budget. So the work breakdown structure gives you the list of activities. The activity consists of three things. An activity consists of a person responsible for completing that activity. It has a time allocated for how long that person is going to complete that activity, and it has a resource allocated to it. So does the person need a specific resource in order to complete that activity? The time, the resource, then gives you an opportunity to calculate the cost of that particular activity. Because, so as an example, if it's going to be a admin assistant capturing all of the things needed to get a specific advertising campaign on the way, or if it's a desktop publisher that has to design some material, you will then have a look at how much do I pay that desktop designer per hour? How long will this activity take? It will take 5 hours. And then what resources, what additional resources do they need? Do they need data? Do they need a computer? Do they need a space in which they have to work? And those three things, the person, the time, the resources, gives you then ultimately your activity cost. And then you add up all of your activity costs, and that will give you then your budget. I will, at this point, I'll stop. And the next part I will go through is understanding project management within a global context. Thank you very much.